Hello and welcome to Devil's Advocate. How does the government respond to comments and criticisms of the budget? That's the key issue I shall explore today with the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, Montek Singh Ahluwalia. Dr. Ahluwalia, let me start with a comment on the budget from the Economic Times. Strong content, lousy presentation. Was this a poorly drafted budget which mysteriously ignored or failed to mention important signals and messages which ironically were part not just of the documents tabled on the floor of the House, but also statements made by ministers and officials on television thereafter?
Well, I think, this is a point of view. I mean, how should a budget be presented? Should a budget say everything? I think what the finance minister obviously did was to touch on the main points, the broad strategy. He may not have talked about everything which is in the documents, but an analytically sharp reader should bring that out.
All right, let me give you a couple of examples why I think that the things left out weren't just a question of individual discretion, but probably a lapse of judgment. Let's start with the fiscal deficit. The finance minister announced a fiscal deficit of 6.8%. At the states, it becomes 10.8%. Add off-budget items, and people say it's perilously close to 13%. This worried the stock market, which tanked, not just because of the size, but also because the finance minister failed to indicate a roadmap for bringing the fiscal deficit down. And yet the budget papers say that he plans to bring down the fiscal deficit by 1.5% next year and another 1.5% the year after. Now, if that had been part of the budget speech, the stock market might not have fallen so precipitously and despondency might not have set in. Was it not a mistake to leave it out?
I would not judge too much by what happened to the stock market in the course of the day. I mean, the stock market is very important, but day to day, hour by hour variations in the stock markets do not really signal a considered view on the budget. I mean, remember, by the way, that in this period, global stock markets have also fallen. So the notion that what was happening to the stock market was only because of the way the budget was presented is not actually correct.
Let me quote to you what you said to me in Devil's Advocate exactly a month ago on the 7th of June when we spoke about the fiscal deficit. You said, if you have a fiscal deficit of, say, 7% in the current year, and that incidentally is exactly what the fiscal deficit is, objectively, that's high. But if you set it in a set of policies which lets people know it will be 5% and then 4% and then 3%, I don't think people will care too much. Now, the finance minister had the capacity to set it in precisely that context, yet he chose not to do so.
No, that's not fair. I mean, the budget documents clearly put numbers to the objective of bringing it down. The fact that he didn't mention it in the budget speech is a matter of choice in terms of presentation.
But that's what I'm saying. Isn't it a bad choice? Because the stock market fell 877 points and there was despondency in industrial circles.
I don't actually believe that the stock market's movement was due to any sort of conviction that because something was in the documents and not mentioned in the speech, that it lacked credibility.
All right.
As far as industry is concerned, how they react to a budget depends very much on what they're expecting to see. Very often they're focusing on particular incentives. I really wouldn't judge on the basis of the first day's reaction. We should take a cool look at the budget and then see, is it a good budget or not?
Let me then give you a second example of the same thing. This time, disinvestment. It was an important part of the president's address. It was an important part of the economic survey. But when it came to the budget speech, beyond mildly indicating some intention, the finance minister said absolutely nothing. Once again, the stock market took this badly, industrialists took it badly. And yet the funny thing is, hours later on television, the finance secretary revealed the names of 2 companies that could be disinvested within 6 and 8 weeks, and 6 more companies that are in the pipeline for further disinvestment. Now, if that had been revealed by the finance minister in Parliament, once again, the stock market would have been much steadier, and despondency and disillusionment wouldn't have set in.
I don't actually believe. I mean, I'm sure the finance minister would also feel that, if a statement made as opposed to not made in one particular forum would make a huge difference. I mean, he might in fact have made it, but I don't actually believe.
Do you think he should have made it? Do you think he should have made it?
No, it's clear that if somebody feels this is a substantive statement they'd like to see in the budget speech, in the sense that if it's part of policy, there's no harm in making it. But on the other hand, if it's there, if it's brought out later on, he's amply clarified that. So what I'm saying is that industrial reaction should be based on what is now being said, looking at the speech and the reactions to this.
Once again,
I don't think it makes any difference.
Once again, let me quote to you what you said to me in this program on the 7th of June when we talked about disinvestment. You said, the signal we should be giving is, are we willing to do a significant amount of disinvestment over a 3 to 4 year period? It's important to determine and lay down a clear program for the next 3 years. And then you added, I would hope that is what would come out of our current deliberations. You hope
I still
that,
think that's true.
but it hasn't come out, and the finance minister has hidden it if it came out.
Hang on a minute. Hang on a minute. The budget speech is made under very tight time deadlines, very short time since the government took over. What I'm saying is, I hope we have that. Now, whether we have it now, have it a month later, I don't believe whether it's said in the budget speech makes such a huge difference.
Except for the fact
especially since the finance ministry has clarified. Now, I'll give you one reason.
But can I interrupt? No. You see, saying it in the budget speech is important because budgets in India, rightly or wrongly, are taken as seminal moments when the government announces policy. To ignore that the budget is seen in that way and therefore treated differently is to ask for trouble.
Not necessarily. I can think of one reason why the finance minister may have held back.
You mean he didn't have time?
No, simply that he preferred to get cabinet approval. So, you know, the ministry may be working...
Then why did the finance secretary go public 3 years later in TV studios?
Oh, because he said, this is our plan. That means, you know, we're going to put it to cabinet. There's a difference between announcing a plan...
Could the finance minister not have said the same thing, that we have companies in mind, companies that I'm considering, but we'll announce it at an opportune moment?
Well, but that becomes a fine point in terms of detail. No, look, budget speech can be written in many different ways. So you can always say, what about adding this sentence? Why not say something differently? Now that the speech is over and intention has been clarified, I mean, what is our concern? Our concern is that people looking at India, investors, analysts, etc., should be making up their minds, what does government intend to do?
But this is the
problem.
problem.
He's clarified that very clearly.
Well, has he? Because you see, the finance secretary a few hours after the budget speech named 2 companies that would be disinvested within 6 to 8 weeks and 6 more that were in the pipeline. And an hour later, when I interviewed the finance minister for this very channel, I asked him specifically, do you have companies in mind that you intend to consider for disinvestment? And he categorically said no. So even on that, he and the finance secretary said different things.
Exactly. This is precisely why he may not have made the statement in Parliament. I mean, I can see that if the finance secretary is working on a plan and he says we're working on a plan, the minister says until the cabinet has approved the plan, I don't want to make a comment on it.
Let me give you a third example. And this time it's to do with the enormous borrowing requirement of 4 lakh crore which the finance minister announced in his budget. People were frightened of the amount, and particularly because they feared that this will kick up interest rates and squeeze out the private sector. As a result, perhaps the country's most credible business paper, the Business Standard, had an editorial the next day which questioned, is this a counterproductive stimulus? And it expressed its fears that the private sector was being squeezed out. And yet, what happens 24 hours later? The finance secretary announces that the government will ask the RBI to undertake open market operations to buy up bonds worth 50% of the government's borrowing requirement, thus infusing liquidity into the system, easing the pressure on interest rates and easing the pressure on the private sector. Now, if that message had been given 24 hours earlier, you wouldn't have been criticized by the Business Standard, you wouldn't have evoked fear and concern in industrial circles and the stock market.
I don't agree with that, Karan. The Business Standard, like any good newspaper, feels it has a God-given right to criticize. And I don't believe that adding sentences here or there would change that. I mean, let's be clear. Come back to the substance. I think the fiscal deficit issue is a very important one. I'm one of the people in the Planning Commission who have been arguing that we need that extra stimulus. And actually, we are quite grateful that the finance minister, weighing all these issues were weighed. People made the point, why risk a higher fiscal deficit? We have argued strongly that we need the expenditure stimulus because the global economic situation is very difficult. Now, I'm not sure whether the Business Standard's view is that it would have been better not to have the stimulus.
No, the Business Standard's view is that you need to make clear how you're going to get your borrowing without affecting the private sector. The finance secretary had the answer, but the finance minister hid it.
No, let's be clear about it. If you're tolerating a 7.8% of GDP fiscal deficit,
6.8.
Sorry, 6.8, you're right.
But it may be 7.8. That's a Freudian lapse.
No, it won't be. It won't be. I think there's no likelihood, by the way, that the off-budget items this year will be anything like what they were last year.
So we hope, fingers crossed.
No, I mean...
you don't know what's going to happen to oil.
Oh, fine. I mean, you know, if oil prices collapse, the deficit will be much better. If they shoot up, it'll be worse.
Absolutely.
Unless we raise prices.
Can I sum up?
No, but I want to... this is an important point. You see, once you accept that you're going to go for a fiscal deficit of 6.8%, I don't think the finance minister needs to work out how they're going to do the borrowing. And quite frankly, whatever they do, it is going to be a certain draw of resources, and the basic logic of the 6.8 is the private sector in this year is not going to be doing that much.
Let me sum up this part.
Otherwise, there's no case for it.
Let me sum up this part of the discussion by putting it like this, at least on three critical issues: the size of the deficit and how it's to be handled, the question of disinvestment, the question of government borrowing. Clearly, the ministry officials, clearly the finance minister himself had answers that would have allayed concern, that would have stopped the stock market diving, that would have stopped disillusionment setting in. But he didn't reveal them. And I put it to you that in the middle of perhaps the worst economic crisis the country has faced in the last 60 years, to hold back information that would reassure and therefore let some sense of disillusionment and even panic spread is a bad judgment call.
Well, you know, I wouldn't want to debate on differences, why the finance secretary said what he did. You can always argue that, you know, you could do it a little bit differently. But what I do think...
A little bit better as well?
No, anything can be bettered. I mean, you know, that's
You
not...
concede that?
No, anything, not just this speech. See, the important thing is, I don't believe, by the way, and I think the finance minister made that very clear, we should not make the budget speech. It's not like the economic constitution for the whole year. I mean, intelligent people know that he has a constraint on time. He's going to say a certain number of things. Many of these things have been discussed before. I mean, let me say, I myself have been arguing, don't worry about a high fiscal deficit.
Can I interrupt?
If you have a supportive monetary policy, it's okay.
Can I interrupt? He really didn't have a constraint on time. He spoke for virtually 2 hours. He could have gone on for 5 more minutes, 10 more minutes if he wanted to. And secondly, the fact is that the budget is considered a seminal occasion. Now, in the middle of this downturn, to try and change the way people think of the budget is a wrong step to take. It's better to flow with the grain rather than use this moment to change the way people think.
It seems that you would have been happier if certain things which are in the documents were actually put into the speech. The way I look at it is, any worthwhile system of analysis should say, forget about how it's presented, what's the budget saying?
Okay.
And I think all these things are there.
Let's then take a break and let's come back and answer that question. What is the budget saying? Because there's another criticism of the budget that I want to put to you. Was it just a simple accountancy exercise lacking in vision and inspiration, or is that an unfair criticism? We'll be back in a moment's time. See you after the break. Welcome back to Devil's Advocate and an interview with the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, Dr. Ahluwalia. Let's come to another criticism of the budget, that this was simply an accounting exercise, that it was simply a statement of the government's expenditure and revenue. It had no vision for the future, no inspiration to lift sentiment, and worst of all, it overlooked the fact that that's precisely what the market was looking for.
Oh, I don't agree with that at all. I mean, let's be clear about it. The budget essentially repeated, if you like, things that the President's address has already said. We are facing a global slowdown. It's top priority to get our growth rate back. We want the growth to be inclusive. Our expenditure is oriented towards inclusiveness. We are trying to maintain a stimulus to the economy. Yes, the fiscal deficit is high, but then as the budget documents show, we'll bring it down. That's a message.
But one very important message, which was a critical part of the President's address and a very important part of the economic survey, was completely left out of the budget speech altogether. The promise to raise insurance caps. And given that that's a promise that was made 5 years ago but hasn't been fulfilled, and in the eyes of many people, both in India and abroad, had become a credibility test, the finance minister's sudden silence actually panicked people, because it made people feel, is he backing off? Is he trying to find a way around it?
I don't really think that that's a fair statement. You know, let's put it this way. That particular proposal is in Parliament. Well, if you wanted him to say it again, he could have said it again. But I honestly do not believe...
Particularly because by not saying it, he made people wonder and question whether he was backing off.
No, let's be very clear. We didn't have the insurance cap change for the last 5 years, and you had growth of 9%. His big his big task is how to get that growth back. I don't believe, by the way, I really do not believe that changing that cap is crucial to recovering the momentum. It's very crucial for longer term development.
Precisely.
No, but what's the most important thing?
It's crucial to the inspiration. It's crucial to what market sentiment wanted to hear.
Let me put it another way. Suppose Parliament were to pass that law tomorrow, but we were to implement our schemes poorly, and the stimulus is not properly implemented. I think we would be much worse off than concentrating on this and doing this a little bit
But it's
later.
not an either-or. Why could he not
Absolutely.
have done both?
I
He should
agree.
have done both. Let me give you another example. When I interviewed you on the 7th of June, we spoke about the need to use this moment to deregulate the oil price. And this is what you said to me. There's no question that price reform is very important. It's a significant part of the agenda. And then you added, anything else, quite frankly, is not economically sustainable. This could be a good time to bring about that rationalization. But what did the finance minister do? He appointed yet another committee, the fourth altogether, the third in 2 years. And the message from that is he's either prevaricating or worse, he's sweeping it under the carpet.
This is not a finance ministry issue.
Then why talk about it at all in the budget?
Let me make one more point. Since we spoke, the government has in fact raised oil prices. Now I agree it hasn't linked them explicitly, so it's not so much a reform, it's a price adjustment.
Quite right.
It's a very important price adjustment. It is because of that price adjustment and the willingness to make that price adjustment that the government has gained a certain amount of credibility.
But then it was even easier. It's even easier for the finance minister to say that we will now move on to reform beyond adjustment.
But that's what, I mean, to do that reform, he's taken it out, if you like, of the realm only of the Ministry of Petroleum and made a government statement that we're setting up a committee.
Yes, but when you set up committees in India, that's an excuse for not doing anything, not a way of action.
No, that depends on how long the committee takes. Let me put it this way. I would hope that we can take action on this. I hope this committee gets appointed very quickly and acts accordingly.
Let me put it like this. If you look at the things that the finance minister chose to mention vis-a-vis those that he deliberately ignored, questions come to mind. For instance, why is it possible for him in his budget speech to talk about a slum-free India, a national literacy mission for women, the food security bill, and keeping banks and insurance companies in government hands, but not possible for him to talk about issues like FDI and insurance, opening up coal and nuclear power, which you're committed to do, or even financial reform? Why is one set of messages possible and not the other?
Well, I mean, I think you should get clarity on this from the ministry itself. I'm not aware that what is being planned on this is not going to happen. What you're really saying is you would have liked to hear a sentence in the budget speech.
And in fact, the country and analysts would have, because by not giving those messages, he's actually given the impression that this government is low-key on reform. It's not a priority item.
No. I think enough statements have been made by the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister, and in clarifications after the budget, he's responded to many of these points.
Oh, after the budget he has to respond because there was a sense of concern in the Finance Ministry. But did you read the headlines in international papers the day after the budget was presented? A budget for a second-tier developing nation, the Wall Street Journal. Indian budget disappoints investors, the Financial Times. And closer to home, common minimum Pranab, the Indian Express. Pranab sells a sob story. Is that the message the government wanted to send out?
I think, managing the headlines one day after the budget is a PR job. And I'm sure the Finance Ministry's press people are handling that.
The Finance Minister didn't make it easier by leaving out crucial things from his budget speech.
No, I think you should look at the government's total message and the budget's total message. And certainly, Finance Minister at different times has said that, look, the economic survey is after all approved by him. It indicates a broad direction, a broad range of reforms. They'll get done in due course. Let me put it this way, we have never taken the view that we're going to lay down in the next 5 days or the next 10 days or even the next month, this is what we're going to do.
Okay.
What we've said is that this is the broad direction we're going to follow. But timelines are not yet given. That's the key thing.
Let's hope people are listening to you, and let's hope it's your words that they take to heart rather than the missing words from the Finance Minister's speech. A pleasure talking to you.
Nice.